Hi, everyone. I am excited to bring back Dr. Professor Dylan Rodriguez to AAPA Women Leads community care and capacity building conversations. Can you tell everyone who has never met you who you are and what you are doing with your life?
Sure. First of all, don't ever call me doctor again. That was weird. Just call me by my name. I'm Dylan. Nice to meet everybody out there. Say what's up. Put my email in the whatever in the little thing here, so folks can reach out to me if they want. I'm as Connie said, I've been a professor for a while. That's my day job. I work at UC Riverside. I was in ethnic studies for a long time. I'm in a department now that's called media and cultural studies, but I've been doing the same thing regardless of all that. I recently took on the role of president of the American Studies Association, which is this big academic interdisciplinary organization. It's actually pretty cool. A lot of good people in it. Connie's in it. She's on my program committee. There's a lot of other folks in it that people that are watching this may or may not have seen and read and heard in different places. I guess other than that, I've been working with, alongside, through, in accountability with, in community with different forms of anti-prison, anti-carceral, anti-police, radical justice, radical liberation, anti-colonial organizations for pretty much my whole adult life. I've been part of the group that's done the work around the organization Critical Resistance since its foundations in the summer of 1997, I think it was. So yeah, saying that shit makes me feel old. But so I've been doing this stuff as a student, as a organizer, as a thinker, periodically in positions of leadership. But I think about myself as somebody who tries to read and study and build community with people a lot. I try to be as creative as possible and work through a sense of generosity and care and love, which is part of the liberationist tradition that of different peoples that I try to draw from. Is that a good introduction?
Yeah. I was surprised because I was like, I didn't know that you were going to be able to list all these amazing things and then give us kind of your principles. So I appreciate that.
Is that what just happened? I don't
Uh-huh.
know. I was just talking.
You can also tell people that you're a Libra, but that's another day. So
Yeah, I dismiss, and I'm not an astrologist. Just FYI, it's
that's
cool
okay.
if you are. It's
Uh-huh.
cool if you are.
So, okay. So anyways, one of the things that you kind of hinted to or talked about was being one of the co-founders of an organization called Critical Resistance. Critical Resistance, from what I remember and also was a part of, is one of the nation's first prison abolitionist organizations. Can you tell us maybe in a few sentences what Critical Resistance is about, and then tell us what does abolition mean?
That's a lot. So I'll say that it's very flattering when people say that I'm one of the co-founders of Critical Resistance. I always think it's a little bit of a misleading term in a way. I was part of the founding organizing collective. I was in my early 20s at the time. I was completely new to the field of work that a lot of the veterans of that founding collective had been doing for decades and decades. So being part of that founding collective, I think, is an important political story for folks that might be listening to this, in the sense that,
Real quick, Dylan,
yeah.
can you tell us who was a part of that collective?
Yeah, I could get the list if you want. I could read all 23. It was like 23, 24
Oh,
people.
okay.
The principal person was Professor Angela Davis, who I had taken a course with, and she's the one who invited me to join. It was former social and political prisoners, Dorsey Nunn, who's there in the Bay, been doing work for a long time as well. A former political prisoner named Rita Bo Brown, peace to Bo. It was radical attorneys, for actually, frankly, some liberal kind of civil rights, prisoners' rights type attorneys. It was grad students that were on their way to getting their PhDs, and a couple undergrads, a couple recent undergrads. It was a collective of a lot of college educated people, and then folks who hadn't had formal education, some of them since middle school. So it was an interesting group of people, but it was bonded by, on the one hand, this is the mid 90s, right? It was bonded by the notion that the astronomical expansion of what we still called the prison industrial complex. It is not mass incarceration. It is the prison industrial complex. It is a carceral industrial complex. If we're going to be expansive about it, include jails, you know, youth facilities, so-called youth facilities, and detention sites, you know, glorified concentration camps for undocumented people. We were bonded around the notion that that astronomical expansion of this carceral complex was not in any way being sufficiently addressed by existing forms of legal work, political work, or policy work.
Okay.
It was, I think, the guiding sense at that point, the thing that brought these different kinds of people into some sense of working organizational unity, for lack of a better term, I mean, it's basically an organizational unity, was the idea that we had to think and do other kinds of things to challenge this astronomical expansion. Perhaps the most influential words came from people like Dorsey Nunn and Bo Brown. For me, in addition to other folks, Ruthie Gilmore, of course, was there. You know, Gina Dent was there. You know, Angela was there. But and of course, I respect and I think about them as my teachers. Dorsey and Bo said things that stood in such contrast from what almost anyone else in the group would say, because Dorsey framed it as genocide. Right? Dorsey's from East Palo Alto, and okay. So Dorsey was the one who framed this thing as genocide. It's the first time I'd heard that. I'd thought about different forms of state repression, anti-colonial war, anti-black occupations and warfare and so forth. I hadn't thought about this astronomical emergence of the carceral state as genocide. Dorsey's the one who pretty much introduced that idea to me, and then I started hearing echoes in my head with other people who I had read, heard, and seen. Right. So Manning Marable, right? I got it. You know, the late Manning Marable, in his book How Capitalism Underdeveloped Black America, has a chapter that actually concludes with the notion that he's writing here, I think in the late 80s, or sorry, in the early 80s at this point, right? So it's just at the onset of what we now call the drug war, which is, I think, a misnomer, right? The state called it the drug war. What it actually was a war against Black folks principally, and poor, displaced, disfranchised, and oftentimes, you know, unsheltered, food insecure populations, you know, brown populations, undocumented populations, you know, queer and trans people and so forth. Marable concludes the chapter by saying if shit doesn't change, if there's not a radical shift in political economy and in politics, then he writes about how the Black community is facing the prospect of genocide. And this is the early 80s, right? And so then Dorsey says this in more than one organizing meeting, because as you know, in the Bay, we start all our meetings by doing like a 5-hour check-in with each other. Right? I'm being facetious about that, but like it was a chore. It's kind of a chore, right? Because like you listen to everybody, and some people you're sick of. I'm just being real. Some people you're sick of hearing their bullshit, right? And then every now and then somebody says something in the check-in that will fuck with you in a really important and constructive way, right? And Dorsey was one of those people every time we checked in. Because more than once he would say, I'm from East Palo Alto. I did my time as a social prisoner. I got caught up in this thing they call the drug war. He said, I see what this system, meaning the carceral system and the policing regime, is doing, the criminalizing regime is doing to my people in East Palo Alto, meaning Black people in East Palo Alto. And he said, I think it is genocide, right? And so that sat with me. It still does obviously sit with me, right? Because I remember it like it was 2 hours ago that I was in that meeting with him. And it was really telling how there was no legible response among our group to the things that Dorsey would say. And Bo Brown would say similar kinds of things, right? Bo being what we would now call a trans person, but Bo being somebody who was part of an armed, you know, a white person who was part of a revolutionary armed Black liberation struggle in the Northwest, had done time as a political prisoner, and Bo thought about it as war. So Bo would use the terms of warfare, insurgency, and counterinsurgency. So it was in the same continuum of analysis and of politics and of language. So I'll say that when I think about that time, I think about myself as a laborer, right? For that emerging organization, primarily as a laborer. In a good way. I don't mean that in a pejorative way at all, right? I worked. I attended every meeting. I think I've attended every meeting. and I was looking for ways to make myself useful as a worker, right?
Right.
But at the same time, as you can probably hear from the way I'm talking about it, I thought about myself as a student of this group of people and of this emerging movement. So what unfolded through the next, I'd say, 3 to 4 years, right, from the founding moments of this collective through the 1998 conference that was held at UC Berkeley that drew several thousand people from all over the world, right? Geronimo Gijaga had just gotten out of prison as a political prisoner. I remember, I'll never forget how he spoke there. And he was, he was really generous with the spirit that he brought to the stage when he walked in, right? Having just coming out of, being a political prisoner for X number of years, and telling people to, he's saying you all need to embrace each other. He was just saying, like, the spirit of generosity that he brought to the table was really transformative for, I think, a lot of us. So through that 1998 conference into the 2000s, I think the organization realized that the politics that it was by necessity going to be premised on was an abolitionist politics.
Okay.
In that the sense of frustration, of inadequacy, and of struggle that bound that group together in a working unity needed to shift into another kind of politics. And so the politics was, well, okay, if we take, and this is how I've always thought about it, if we take what Dorsey Nunn, Bo Brown, and other people say, right, in their analysis of this carceral complex that's emerged, this policing complex that's emerged, if we take what they say seriously, and if the rest of us understand that we all have a role to play in dealing with this thing, we really don't have a choice other than to work toward a constructive vision of abolishing it, right? Because you don't reform genocide, right? And you don't reform asymmetrical warfare, right? And by asymmetrical, that's what the drug war really was, right? It was essentially a one-sided war by a white supremacist, anti-Black, and colonial state against Black people, disfranchised people, displaced people, insecure, housing and politically, economically insecure people, and so forth, right? It's an asymmetrical war, right? That's also equipped by the state facilitating internecine war among people in the community, right? This is to this day. Sorry, one more time.
What's internecine mean?
Internecine meaning warfare that happens among oppressed people. In my case, that's what I mean, right? Internecine just means among the same kind of community or within the same community of people. In this case, I'm concerned with how people who are in conditions of disfranchisement, oppression, and subjection are essentially encouraged to kill each other, right? Native American radicals, scholars refer to it as auto-genocide, right? So then I'm hearing all this, and you see the ongoing effects of what we could call auto-genocide among people. It's like you can't take a reform approach to that, really, right? In the end, you have to actually get rid of those dynamics. You have to completely overthrow those things. That's what a true liberationist insurgency is. You have to get rid of that shit. Everything else is casualty management.
So what I hear you saying is that the origins of the organization were a collective of about 20-something people from different parts, students, political prisoners, formerly incarcerated, professors, legal, scholars, experts, liberal, and radical, right? And I hear you all gathering together to address the expansion of what was at the time the prison industrial complex. Now we understand it to be a carceral state. And then I hear you saying that members of that core group, including Dorsey Nunn and Bo Brown, kind of interjected an analysis of genocide and warfare within this collective. And so as you expanded in the following couple of years, you recognized, folks were already saying it, because I attended the 98 conference, right? Folks were already saying that we were abolitionists, not necessarily understanding why. I think at some point we were intuitively knowing that needed to be abolished.
Well, no, I disagree. I think we knew why. Right. We knew why we needed to be abolitionists because we saw what was going on. I think we didn't know what that meant fully.
Okay, I
right?
get.
You see what I'm saying? Yeah. Sorry to interrupt.
No. I understand.
I
Um,
interrupt you a lot.
yeah, I know, but we'll talk about that later. So I think, here we are finding the language and the frameworks to define what it is we were up against, right? And
Yeah,
so
exactly.
I hear you saying that the move then needed to be much more explicit, that we needed to abolish uh, uh, a structure, not just these institutions and these buildings, but a structure that was a genocidal one, one that was waging war, was a part of a war against Black peoples in particular and our most neglected communities. That being
Yeah, asymmetrical war, especially asymmetrical war, right?
well, you and I had this conversation and you called it war, and I was like, yo, it can't be war because nobody can fight back. Like at least in Vietnam, we had
Right.
the
Even
possibility.
that was even that was somewhat of asymmetrical war, which is why people turned to guerrilla warfare, right? I
Right,
mean, yeah, so the asymmetry is different too. So I mean, and people do fight back, but it's not symmetrical.
right.
You know what
But
I mean? Like,
so abolition then becomes the pretense of abolition for you all, and then ideally today is around abolishing an entire structure and mechanism of genocide and war.
in my, yeah. So
Okay.
so are we? So I mean, that whole 10 minutes I just gave you was just it's partly just biography. So like chop that up and whatever, right? That wasn't even me talking about abolition yet. That was more talking about like, in a sense, my own origins,
Uh-huh.
but also trying to deal with thinking in a very kind of intimate historical way about the development of what we now know as an abolitionist movement.
Mm.
That's gained legibility, that's circulated on social media, that's made its way into mainstream dominant corporate news at this point,
Mhm.
and which is quickly being appropriated by different kinds of folks who I don't think are committed to an actual politics, practice, or analysis that is abolitionist, right? So I want to spend some time at some point in this conversation addressing that, because I think that's a really critical wave of counterinsurgency,
Mhm.
meaning anti-abolitionist, counter-abolitionist repression
Mhm.
that we are in at this moment. And I think we've been in it for a little while, but we're going to be in it for a little for the at least the near future. So yeah, so what you're saying is on point.
Mhm.
Um, I think I think what folks were drawing from as well was an abolitionist history, meaning a history of abolitionist struggles. So there had been articulations of anti-prison abolition through periods of the 20th century,
Mhm.
right? There had been one in particular, the most recent resurgence of it prior to the mounting of it at the turn of the 20th and 21st centuries was around the 70s or so, right? There was a kind of radical abolitionist criminology that was emerging that eventually got smashed at UC Berkeley. Those folks writing still, is relevant to this day. And then there was also a set of organizing, of movements and organizing
Mhm.
that were kind of articulating really in the aftermath of Black and Black led prison rebellions, including Attica and other places, Attica, San Quentin,
Mhm.
Soledad, everywhere,
Mhm.
that were pushing the politics toward an abolitionist politics, right? So there was that piece of it. And then of course the long history in the carceral chattel anti-black plantation state, right? And economy and what Cedric Robinson of course famously calls racial capitalism, that the only feasible approach that chattel enslaved Africans took to that was an abolitionist one, which meant both the above the ground political abolitionist discourse that we hear all the time, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, Harriet Tubman, all the way, all the way to armed guerrilla plantation struggle against the plantation state, you
Okay.
know, from, Denmark Vesey, Gabriel Prosser, Nat Turner, to some extent, John Brown, and so forth. So I think those folks who were starting to embrace the terms of abolition were thinking at our best, we were thinking about the full historical totality of different forms of abolitionist struggle, particularly as they are situated against the United States, right? Against the United States as a project that is a carceral project, meaning it is a project that is premised on capturing and immobilizing people, on socially liquidating people, targeted populations. It is based on enslaving people, Black people, as the paradigm for chattel enslavement. I mean, this is what the United States as a nation state is based on, right? And part of that logic of carcerality, it's a term we all need to know. Everybody needs to know what the term carcerality is, right? It's about the logic of human capture. It's not just jails and prisons. It's principally jails and prisons, but it is not just jails and prisons. A lot of the schools that people go to are deeply carceral in that same continuum. I mean, shoot, Connie's writing and scholarship on this is some of the best I know. Yours and Damien's Sojourners are this. I always come back to it. Schools as carceral sites within this continuum. That shit has to be abolished as well. That's not what schools are supposed to be. That's not what education is supposed to be. So at its best, as an abolitionist kind of politics practice and collective thought started to surge around this time in the early 2000s, I would say, a lot of us started really, first of all, we started reading and talking voraciously, right? Debating with each other voraciously, right? Teaching and learning all the time. I think that's really critical. I think that is the principal abolitionist practice, by the way. Right, is that it's the constant exchange, the constant debate, the constant engagement. I mean, if you look at the history of abolition struggle, including insurrections against plantations, that shit was fueled by deep collective thought and debate, right? So I honor that all the time, right? I say stuff like this conversation we're having, that's part of it, right? This is situated for me as part of an abolitionist practice, because we got to figure shit out. We have to have an analysis and principles that bind, that bind us with each other. But we have to hash it out. We have to think through it. So in terms of the last 20 or 25 years of it, that's where this thing wasn't still is moving. It's premised on this conviction that the United States as a national and global project is so premised on the infrastructures of policing and capturing people, Black people in particular, paradigmatically, right? Indigenous people in terms of land displacement and colonization. Women, right? Cisgender hetero women in particular, in terms of heteronormative institutions, right? That are premised on the incarceration, and the gender domestication of women historically, particularly in kind of the compounded ways that Black women, brown women, working class women and others are tethered to a structure that not only is based on, unpaid domestic labor, but is also based on essentially the decriminalization of sexual violence. Yeah.
Okay, so Dylan, I so many things. I'm wondering if you could help to break down for our audience what abolition is and why it's important.
So what we commit to when we think about a politics of abolition, on the one hand, it's a specific kind of analysis.
Okay.
What it means is that you're looking at institutions that we take for granted. For example, in this particular moment, the police. In this and other moments, places of incarceration, jails, prisons, so-called migrant detention, so-called youth facilities, places where mentally ill and disabled people are incarcerated. That we look at all those things, number one, we stop taking them for granted as if they're what Angela Davis would call a feature of the natural landscape. There's a way that we look at these different human-made colonial anti-Black institutions and we naturalize them.
Okay.
So I would say the most principal thing that one embraces with an abolitionist practice and a kind of abolitionist community is to refuse to take those things for granted and to realize that they are not natural. In fact, it's the opposite. They're entirely human-made. They're part of a creation of power relations of dominance and violence that are deeply historical, that go all the way through the multiple periods of enslavement and colonialism, of gender-based violence, patriarchy, and heteronormativity. All these institutions are products of those forms of historical violence, which is to say of the United States. So the other layer of this is to say that, as far as I'm concerned, an abolitionist politics means that you are actually engaged in a radical and at its best, a liberationist, maybe revolutionary challenge to the existence of the United States as such, right? So abolition is not just about getting rid of the police, getting rid of jails and prisons. It is about those things. But at the deepest level, it is about a transformation of a way of being, of a way of life. It is about a conception of community that challenges all these things, all these forms of violence and oppression that are so deeply naturalized. And I'll say one more thing about this. If we think about it historically, that's what abolitionists in different historical periods have always done, right? When Harriet Tubman is engaged in underground armed, guerrilla warfare, it's this thing we call the Underground Railroad, right? This is a radical Black woman-led abolitionist challenge to what at that point was taken for granted as a natural feature of the United States landscape. In parts of the United States to this day, it's still treated that way. That's why monuments are so fucking important. A lot of people don't get that, right? What these Confederate monuments do is they contribute to this centuries-long naturalization of an anti-Black genocidal chattel plantation slave structure, right? So historically, abolitionists have always done this. And what's important for us in this moment to understand is that we're on the historical record, right? All the stuff that we try to do if we embrace an abolitionist politics is going to be judged by the historical record, by people who reflect on this one generation from now, and it's hard. It's hard to develop a collective practice that challenges all these forms of violence that are naturalized. But as far as I'm concerned, at its foundations, what abolition is embracing is the need for a complete transformation. Ruthie Gilmore's new book says this, right? It says, the title of her new book says, change everything, right? So at its root, abolition is a creative, collective struggle to completely overthrow and transform these relations of institutional and infrastructural violence and containment. And it may start with jails, prisons, and police, right? But it certainly doesn't end there. It may not even start there.
Okay. So I think what is important to remember is that in previous conversations that you and I have had, we understand, and this is specifically for our audience members and whomever else listens, if we agree that this nation is based upon anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity, right? If we understand that, and then we understand that these institutions that you have hinted to enable these structures, right? So you've named, the detention centers, you've named prisons, policing, I name in my work, schools, right? Dorothy Roberts names the child welfare services, the foster care system. All of these institutions make this structure of anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity colonialism possible. Now, if we understand that, I hear you saying that our obligation is to abolish these institutions in order to also abolish these structures.
Let me add to that, right? Okay. Let me say two things. One is these institutions are anti-Blackness. All right. So anti-Blackness is the logic, right? But all the institutions that you and I are talking about right now, they are the infrastructure of what we're calling anti-Blackness. And for the folks watching, there's a recent definition of anti-Blackness I'm holding on to. Joao Costa Vargas, Moon Kee Jung, in a forthcoming book. They refer, sorry for reading this, but I feel like it might be useful to folks. They call anti-Blackness, I'm somewhat paraphrasing this. They see anti-Blackness as, this is their word, structured, ubiquitous, and ongoing disadvantages for Black people and structured advantages for non-Black people in the realms of what they call ontology, that is how people define themselves and identify themselves in the world. Sociability, meaning the way people live their social experience at the everyday level, and access to resources. And they also write, the likelihood of social and physical death is a direct function of anti-Blackness. And if you look at Joao Vargas's earlier work, he's talking about genocide. He's talking about anti-Black genocide. So that's what anti-Blackness is, in my conversations here. So those things. So the one point that I want to make is all those infrastructures are they are colonialism. They are anti-Blackness, right? And it's not merely the frontier. Well, I mean, principally it's the frontier, right? The ongoing conquest of the hemisphere, but it's also the United States as a deeply colonial project in all the different ways colonialism happens, right? So it's both genocidal frontier conquest in the North American, hemisphere, and then it's also all this shit that brought you and me to this wretched fucking place. Right? It's all these forms of, the conquest in the Philippines was clearly a genocidal conquest, right? The war in Vietnam was clearly genocidal, if, at bare minimum was proto-genocidal, if not genocidal. So these infrastructures we talk about are those things. The second point I want to make, what abolition in my view, is also doing in a very active way is it's challenging us to recognize how it is that the logic of human capture
Mhm.
spreads into all the institutions that we take for granted beyond prisons, jails, and detention centers, right? So let's think about, and this is what I think abolitionists can do, right, and do try to do, is let's think about how the logic of incarceration is so endemic to everyday institutions,
Mhm.
right? In both brick and mortar institutions and also ways of living. Heteronormativity and patriarchy are utterly carceral,
Mhm.
right? The decriminalized way that sexual violence is allowed to flourish, you know, by the state and by the police is absolutely a carceral, it's a gendered, misogynist, transphobic, etc. carceral logic. It is about immobilizing and capturing people within a certain logic of violence.
Mhm.
So when we say carcerality or when we say carceral, we're focusing on places where people are incarcerated by the state.
Mhm.
But that's not the only way that carcerality happens. So if we're going to be fully embracing
Mhm.
the creativity, the vision, the challenge, and the collective community building, really,
Mhm.
of abolition, then what we're pushing back up against are
Mhm.
all these forms of carcerality that permeate our lives,
Mhm.
right? So that's we're actually trying to decarcerate and liberate ourselves and this world around us in fundamental ways, which is why I said earlier, it may or may not begin with jails and prisons,
Mhm.
right? It may or may not begin with police. We actually, if we go at those things, we have to recognize that shit, in some ways, I think Angela said this a long time ago, and she still says it now, that we carry the cops around with us in our heads,
Mhm.
right? We carry the cops with us in how we treat each other, how we act with each other, how we talk to each other. Shit, I'm probably doing it right now,
Mhm.
right?
So I think
Yeah.
I think it's important, the number of layers that you've talked about, both carcerality as in capture. Many of us also kind of translate it to policing, right? So we say policing for capture, for surveillance, right? And so when people there are a lot of new people coming to abolition. And so what we want for folks to recognize, is that abolition does not just mean the abolition of the police violence that they see on TV, but policing writ large at, through schools, through these different institutions that we talked about. We're trying to get rid of policing as a form of anti-Blackness and coloniality at writ large, right? So we're doing that. And then you also helped us to remember policing and carcerality happens in our fantasies and in our everyday forms of being, right? And that's what Jaume, the book that you referenced, that's what they're also talking about, right? It happens at multiple levels. So we want to abolish it at multiple levels, right? So the next question I have for you is that, there is a lot of talk around solidarity work, and a lot of our, audience here at AAP Women Lead, they're Asian and Pacific Islander self-identified women and girls. And many of our audience members are thinking about their relationship to anti-Blackness, their relationship to policing. I'm noticing that in response to anti-Asian violence, people have now, talked about arresting people, convicting them of hate crimes, right? So what does racial solidarity mean, and what does it look like for our communities in this context?
Principally, especially in reference to the things you just said, Connie, if people are going to be serious about solidarity with the struggle, a radical struggle, an abolitionist struggle against anti-Blackness, right? If the point is to abolish anti-Blackness,
Mm-hmm.
right? If the point is to abolish for that matter, other intersecting and overlapping forms of violence that are fueled and premised on what we're calling anti-Blackness, then folks need to recognize from jump
Mm-hmm.
that you cannot turn to the anti-Black colonial racist state for your fucking solutions,
Okay.
right? Especially hate crime policies and legislation, right? Hate crimes were formulated by liberals, number one, to compartmentalize and individualize anti-Black, homophobic, misogynist, and other forms of violence,
Mm-hmm.
to compartmentalize them and individualize them to individual acts of violence when that shit is deeply structural.
Mm-hmm.
It's what people are now calling systemic, right? But it's systemic not just in the way the system operates.
Uh-huh.
It's systemic in how the infrastructures were created from the start,
Okay.
right? So if we understand that the state itself is fundamentally colonial and anti-Black, and that has never gone away, right? If we understand that the state itself is already premised on the selective containment and neutralization of entire communities of people, entire profiles of people, you cannot go to the state for your solutions. So that's a number one. So we got to challenge that and stop that.
Okay. So I appreciate your emphasis on saying, on reminding people, if they want to be about solidarity, then they cannot rely on state apparatuses or apparati that, whatever it is, that are anti-Black and colonial, right? They're really about solidarity.
That's what the state, but I'm saying that's what the state is, right? There's not a part of the state that's anti-Black and colonial, a part of the state that's not. That is the state, people. So we got to come up with solutions and forms of community and justice and interpersonal accountability and even redistribution, right? And you know, reconciliation, or whatever you want to call it, that do not rely on the apparatuses of the state.
Okay, so there's two things that I want to ask you, which is I'm hearing this, and then I hear you talk about the need for us to rely on each other, right? I think that's super important. There are two thoughts to that. One is, how do we imagine relying on each other? What could that potentially look like? And then I also want to remind people that these forms of violence you've hinted to is structural in their root, they're structural, they're structurally induced. They're made possible by the violence of the state to begin with, right? And I say that because, for instance, in Chinatown in Oakland, a lot of property was, destroyed. And we come to find out, even in a news article today, that one of the buildings that were set on fire was actually done by the police, right? So we learned that. And then we also learned from rumors that the police knew that some of the protests were going to be walking through Chinatown. People are angry, and there was no support to preempt any of the kind of, or to support any of the angers in ways that were helpful. That isn't to say that I'm against the looting, but I am to say that some of the violence that took place were aided in many ways by the police. So
yeah, as far as the way police will in the state generally, but the police in particular, they have tactics for dealing with street protests, with mass street demonstrations. Y'all see it if you're out there. They line their motorcycles up on particular blocks. They deploy people officers. They're not people, they're officers on horseback to funnel people in a certain direction. They look the other way with particular forms of violence, meaning people getting beat up, people getting shouted at, people getting spit on, people getting guns drawn on them. And we see this all over the United States right now, right? This is we need to understand that is not just idiosyncratic, random incidents. These are things that are entirely tactically anticipated, facilitated, and encouraged by the state's ways of approaches to managing mass demonstrations, especially when it's led by Black liberationist politics, sentiment, and insurgencies. So all that, yes, I think we have to think about it that way.
Okay. And then just to go back to the first point is, when you say things like folks need to figure out ways to rely on each other because the state has undermined that possibility, right? They've kind of gotten in the way of us being able to rely on each other as a part of the system. Can you tell us what that means to take care of one another under a context of violence?
I'm gonna stand on or work from, I shouldn't say stand, I'm gonna work from the premise that my friend and the brilliant writer and thinker Dean Spade has articulated this in recent days. What Dean says is that we need to, number one, we need to stop thinking about the forms of political work we do as if it's necessarily having to build towards some massive, big, giant organization that goes across the entire country or even across the entire city or state, right? So I want to honor and respect and agree with what Dean says when he points at how important it is to proliferate localized, grassroots, community-based forms of struggle, of accountability, of justice, of beauty, you know what I mean? Of rebuilding interpersonal modes of interaction and accountability and justice and whatnot. So in a shorthand way, what I would say in answering your question is the way that these forms of abolitionist community building look must be shaped by where you are at, right? And it makes me uncomfortable to say this because I'm a recovering Catholic, right? I don't want to go anywhere near Catholic church unless it's in the Philippines with, you know, my family members because it's, you know, the holidays and it's cool, right? I want nothing to do with religion. I'm pretty secular. I think I'm probably atheist, right? However, I am 100% on board, and I would be there if the community I was in had to work with some kind of congregation, whether it's a church or something else, as the initial abolitionist infrastructure through which to rethink how we do community, how we do interpersonal relationships, how we deal with conflict, even violence with each other in ways that don't rely on bringing the state back. So we have to think about this localized, intimate set of dynamics that we already inhabit. And I'm saying whether you're talking at the level of your apartment building, right, or your block, like that's where the analysis and the building, this abolitionist community building, has to happen, and that shit is effective. You know, if you can reach those points of principled community with people, even if you don't fucking like them, and that's the most important place to do it, is people that don't, you're not necessarily going to be friends. I'm not doing this kumbaya thing. I want to make sure people understand that, right? This is not about everybody being fucking friends, right? This is about having principles of community on which we agree. So even though we don't like each other, right, we agree in our community on particular abolitionist principles that, shoot, we are mutually protecting each other by doing that, right? We are in a sense preempting the possibility that we are going to bring the state and the police into this in such a way that somebody's going to get arrested, somebody's going to get beat up by the cops, somebody's going to get shot, or for that matter, the state will come in and not do shit, right? And reproduce the interpersonal forms of violence and exploitation that we called them in to address to begin with. And again, sexual violence, right? Violence against children, sexual violence against women, girls, cisgender, transgender, otherwise. That's a principal example of how this works, right? The state has never addressed that, right? Which is why I'm so, I think all of us are so indebted to the rise of abolitionist Black feminism as a counterpoint to carceral, what people call carceral feminism, meaning forms of feminism that rely on the intervention of criminalization, police, and the state to solve the problems that feminist analysts and activists bring up.
I think it's also important. I like you reminding us to localize things, because I think a lot of people who have been in the gender-based violence movement, API women leaders, like folks in our community, most of us have not relied on the police as survivors, right? We've had to find ways to take care of ourselves and find ways to hold harm doers accountable if it's possible, and very rarely is it done by the police, right? So it'll look like calling on friends, calling on potential, you know, Dylan, if something ever happens to me, Dylan,
Absolutely.
where I live, where my keys are, you know, my sister knows where my keys are. They know who's like potentially causing me harm. You know what I mean? So I think,
yeah.
even at
Yeah, no, you're so on point with this. And here's another thing we got to do. We got to start sharing these fucking stories all the time so that people realize that abolitionist practices of community are not this kind of blueprint that all of us have to find on the internet somewhere and then like bring into our circles and read and implement. It's like, okay, that's part of it. Like a lot of us are putting shit out there to share, okay? But if we share some of these stories and reframe them as abolitionist stories, because that's what they are, right? Then it number one, it demystifies all that stuff, and people realize, oh fuck, I might be actually a kind of practicing abolitionist a certain kind of way that I hadn't thought about. Let me get a little bit more deeply into that, right? One of my favorite people in the world, Martha Escobar, right? The great author and scholar and teacher. She's at Cal State Northridge. She tells a story now, right? And it's an abolitionist story about an intervention that she and her family staged within her own family to essentially transform and completely overturn, abolish a dynamic of sexualized and gender violence within her own family. I'll let her tell the story. I don't want to tell it for her, but I will say that she's told this story in different kinds of public settings, in settings of, you know, activists, students, and others, in ways that reframe how we understand what an abolitionist politics, practice, and community building is. Because she talks about this just at the site of her immediate family, and it fucking worked, right? The person who they were holding accountable for their behavior and for their violence was altered, challenged, and transformed by it. And it's not perfect, right? It's a struggle, but the account that she gives is like, yeah, you know, this actually interrupted this dynamic that was decades long, right? This person is a different person now. That shit works, man. That shit works. And so I'm saying if we can just understand the locality, the intimacy, the interpersonal dynamic and foundation of what abolition actually is, you know, then we can do this at different levels. It doesn't just have to be these levels of intervention. It can be us getting a group of us together. I know we're just talking about you doing this. Study groups, man, like go watch a film together, go read a book together and just talk through it, right? Ideally, it would be a film or a text that is somehow facilitating a discussion of abolitionist, you know, principles and politics and analysis and whatnot, right? So it's all those things. But I think that we need to understand where the grassroots are. They're where you are. The grassroots are where you are, right? The abolitionist grassroots are where you are right now as you fucking watch this, right? And like shit, we got to take advantage of all this virtual stuff too, right? Like that's the grassroots for lack of being able to be with each other interpersonally, right? And kind of, you know, feel each other in that fleshly kind of way, right? We have trouble doing that right now, so we got to take advantage of other kinds of ways to do that work. But it's where you're at. Abolition is where you're at.
So I think that's important. I think it's you know, I've talked to a couple people who are organizers, and one of the things we often say, without having to reduce what organizing is, we often talk about organizing and abolitionist organizing as good friendships, you know, like being really down for each other and taking care of each other. And it's a lot about relationship building. So, you know, I think about, you know, I initiated like a text thread with all the folks in this apartment building. So anything that pops off, we all know each other and can text one another, you know. And it's very, again, it's just communal, and it's something that we were always, if people center themselves in the practices they had, most of us, you know, we had beef with somebody, very rarely, unless you were, you know, super pro police, would you call the cops? You know, so I think that's important for us to recenter that everyday form of living, and then build out accordingly.
So can I add something to this though? Because I don't want to let it just stay at the level of, and I don't mean to minimize it that way. I think it's important that we think simultaneously with these forms of intimate and localized grassroots abolitionist practice, to think about our wildest abolitionist ambitions to change the fucking world around us, right? I think we have to do those things simultaneously. One thing is not more important than the other, so don't get me, you know, twisted that way. If anything, you could probably make the argument that the grassroots where you are right now is probably the most important thing, because without that, you don't have a foundation and nobody's going to show up for you and you're not going to show up for anybody else, right? So you got to be in the place where you're going to show up for each other, right? Which is how I take what you just said. At the same time, we need to think about, you know, whether and how we have an opportunity to actually transform the world around us, guided by abolitionist analysis and principles. And we are in that historical moment right now. So when you asked me, you know, minutes ago about what solidarity with the struggles, Black-led struggles, but Black radical and Black feminist radical-led struggles in particular against anti-Blackness and anti-Black policing means right now, it's those things simultaneously, right? Which means that you're going to try to build concrete forms of dialogue and accountability with other communities. Well, I don't mean other, with surrounding communities, intersecting communities, and movements, right? However it is that you choose to identify a movement where you are at, right? If you're incarcerated, a movement's going to look and feel a lot different than if you're in Minneapolis right now, right? So when I say movement, I don't mean one kind of thing. So we have to think across these different scales of collectivity, right? From the scale of the collective that's in your apartment building, or even your apartment for that matter, to the scales of collectivity that at this point are going global, right? What does it mean to be part of and do work that is accountable to all those communities, or tries to be accountable to all those communities at the same time, right? And you have to be guided by principles.
So I think that's important around localizing and then expanding it globally. I think to your point around folks who are incarcerated, when we think about building solidarity and being in relationship, we want to, one, abolish these structures that are anti-Black colonial projects. And that means not only freeing people, getting rid of the brick and mortar, but also forming relationships with each other. inside and outside of all these institutions, right? So I think I hear all of that. So we're gonna wrap it up, and I know that you have a book that's coming out.
I don't want to wrap it up.
I know you don't, but we're gonna build a relationship beyond the Zoom call. And you know, I've been working together since, you know, for 20 something years. So we've kind of grown, we've been
Did I
growing.
know you when you were actually a teenager?
Yeah,
That's deep, huh? Because we're old as shit now.
you are. And there's nothing wrong with
No,
being older.
no,
Um,
I'm
but
still young.
I was 19, 18 or 19, 18 or 19. But moving on, I know you're avoiding it. I want you to tell us and our folks who are listening, what's your book about?
So I have a book coming out soon. It's called White Reconstruction. That's the title. There's no subtitle. It's called White Reconstruction. It's an attempt to get us to rethink what this half century ongoing 50 years since the victories of the so-called victories of the civil rights movement have kind of transpired and been institutionalized. It's a way to rethink what people oftentimes call the post-civil rights
Mhm,
period.
mhm,
And for a minute, we're calling the post-racial era, right? I
mhm.
think that's gone now. But
Mhm.
people still are attached to this idea of post-civil rights. So I want to think about how it is that periods of liberal and progressive reform, particularly gendered racial reform, are actually, on the one hand, structured in carceral anti-Blackness and racial colonial violence, right?
Okay.
That the reforms themselves are guided by carceral anti-Blackness and racial colonial violence, right? The reforms themselves.
Mhm,
And the effects of those reforms reproduce, if not expand, the logics and violence of anti-Blackness and racial colonialism.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
that's the basic premise of it. I also want to think about how there's a longer history to that,
mhm,
this kind of dynamic of racial colonial and anti-Black violence being reproduced in reform is not new.
mhm,
It's as old as the United States is old. That's the basic premise of the book. I mean, first chapter I look at the LAPD's diversity. Part of what I look at is LAPD's attempt to enhance its diversity profile with something called Join LAPD, is a big hiring campaign that's still going on now,
mhm.
and kind of seeing how they went about doing that and how it was accompanied by particular forms of increase in LAPD anti-Black violence in particular. Um, there's another chapter where I try to take up and challenge the phrasing that a lot of us use of mass incarceration, because it's not mass incarceration,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
So I want to rethink what terms we use. I want to rethink about using the terms of carceral warfare, of
mhm,
gendered anti-Black and racial colonial carceral warfare, because it's asymmetrical. That's what it is. It is not mass incarceration. It is targeted
mhm,
in policing and incarceration.
mhm.
Um, and then it kind of ends with a reflection on abolition, not unlike what we just did here.
Nice. That
So if you don't, so I hope a few people read it, but at the risk of pissing off the press, I encourage you to steal it. I encourage you to download that shit as an ebook and put it out. And when I get my author's copies, I'll send them to you.
I want one. Okay. So we're gonna thank you for summarizing that. There's a point I just want to, close it up by saying one of the reasons why we had this interview was because we wanted people to have um, uh, a good, strong definition of abolition, because it's been in the works for decades, if not centuries, probably more centuries. And at the core, like some of the tenets of abolition is to destroy and dismantle structures, ways of being, not just police violence what you've seen on TV. So it's bigger and broader and requires way more people. You have also talked about the need to get ahead of the definition is because it's really easy to appropriate it, right? And to fold it back into the structure.
Yeah.
So I am grateful for you, and helping us to accurately and more radically define abolition, because what we are up against, like you said, is genocide and warfare. Um,
Just to close this thing out, I want to just ask a favor of everybody out there.
mhm,
Please be as analytical and as attentive as you can possibly be to the ways that folks around you who didn't used to use the terms and try to flow with the politics of abolition are using and trying to flow with it now. What Connie just mentioned is so important about how certain key words and key terms get traction in the public kind of discourse, in the media and social media discourse, and become really attractive, and people grab onto them. They start sometimes, taking on the identity, a public identity, as abolitionists, when in fact the things they're proposing are entirely counter, if not anti-abolitionist. Police reform
Mhm.
is in large part not, it's not inherently abolitionist, and in many cases it actually undermines abolitionist work, right? So we have to be really careful in engaging with things like police reform, or even defunding the police,
Mhm.
right, in ways that don't facilitate other forms of policing.
Mhm.
We need to take an abolitionist approach and develop an abolitionist analysis of all these things, by which we mean things that will facilitate the interruption and ultimate extinction of forms of oppressive, gendered anti-Black and gendered racial colonial violence, right? The things that will facilitate the destruction of those things and the creation of other forms of community, other forms of safety, other forms of being. We got to be attentive to that, because the current wave of counterinsurgency, meaning repression, is going to come in the form of liberal progressive appropriations of the terms of abolition. So we got to watch out for that and challenge it.
Okay, that makes sense. I think people's proclivities to save this infrastructure or these structures are very real and repetitive and compulsory. So I think
Yep.
you're reminding people that whatever activism, organizing, or knowledge they're going to reproduce and be engaged in
Yeah.
has to be to end the way that things are.
Don't let's not get ourselves stuck in this ridiculous pathway of trying to reform genocide.
Hmm. I
All
like.
right. I mean, that's in a word. Like, we need to stop trying to reform genocide. We
Mhm.
need to figure out how to get rid of it.
Right. And it also means to
Abolish it.
reconfigure how we understand violence, right? Because people,
Absolutely.
they have a
Absolutely.
monopoly on what violence is versus looking at the ways that they are violent and has caused a lot of harm on our communities.
Yeah, let's think about what's happened to Breonna Taylor, and over here in Riverside, Tyisha Miller in 1998. Rayshard Brooks, George Floyd. Let's think about those things
Mhm.
as in a de-individualized way,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
In a way that does no longer thinks about them as incidents, but thinks about them as symptoms. This is what people are doing, but I still think that there is a vast liberal progressive tendency. You flip on CNN, you flip on MSNBC, you go to social media, there still is a tendency to compartmentalize these things as atrocious incidents,
Mhm.
right? They are not incidents. They are atrocious, but they are not incidents,
Mhm.
right? They are a fundamental reflection of where we are right now, and it has to stop. It
Mhm.
has to transform. It has to be radically challenged. We should be honored to be involved in that work.
Got it.
It's fucking hard work, but we should be honored to be alive to do that work.
Right. I agree. Okay. So thank you, Dylan, Dr. Rodriguez, Professor